Both Israel and Hamas claimed victory after the ceasefire was officially signed on May 21, 2021. Today, we want to explore the topic of which side actually won. The Palestinians view it as a costly but clear victory. This due to Israel not being able to stop the rockets from being fired. Outside of Al-Aqsa Mosque in East Jerusalem, Palestinians also celebrated and cheered on what they perceived as a Hamas victory. However, they were met with the same stun grenades and tear gas in and outside of Al-Aqsa, which is what began the rocket firing by Hamas 11 days prior. In a loss for Israel, hardline Netanyahu supporters thought that he ended the war prematurely. He responded that Israel had caused maximum damage to Hamas with minimal Israeli casualties. The final death count was 256 Palestinians dead and 13 Israelis dead. The final kill ratio being 19.6 Palestinians killed for every Israeli killed. 1,900 Palestinians were injured and 200 Israelis were injured. This means that 9 Palestinians were injured for every Israeli injured. Hamas may have looked beyond the death count for their claims of victory, as they are more focused on international support than the lives of their people. From 1994 to 2016 they have succeeded, as they have gained $2.3 billion each year, which is only 1.7 million less than the $4 billion that Israel receives from the United States. There were also riots, protests and uprisings across Israel. In addition to that, there were protests in the United States by Democrat supporters. However, even with these gains they faced being censored on social media, as their content was often removed. That being said, this was reported by Qatar media Al-Jazeera. With Qatar continuing their support, Hamas also gained support from Indonesia. The most important victory in this regard was China speaking up for Palestine in the UN. They asked that settlements be stopped and the religious sites be respected. As usual, the United States supported Israel with their right to defend themselves. As the war continued, they did pressure Israel to do a ceasefire though. Israel's biggest win from international support was the Palestinian foreign minister calling Hamas a terrorist organization in the UN. Saying that Hamas did not just kill civilians but it also killed Palestinians with their rockets misfiring. The damage to property was high in Gaza, with 16,800 houses being damaged and 1,800 of those being unfit for living. Education, hospitals, and healthcare institutions were also damaged. In addition to that, their greenhouses, agricultural lands and poultry farms were also affected, costing millions in damage. Perhaps most devastating for Hamas was the destruction of 4 mosques and dozens of police offices. Also, most factories were destroyed and the most significant moment was when the Al-Shrouk building was demolished, which housed media outlets. A Palestinian leader estimated the total losses to buildings and infrastructure to be $150 million. Excluding factory damage, Israel believed their total costs to be $166 million. These numbers do seem stark, however they affect Gaza much more than they do Israel. Reuters media released an article, stating how Hamas rarely leaves a scratch on Israel's markets overall. Meanwhile 56% of Gaza lives in poverty. Israel quickly recoups its damages. Israel raised $5.5 billion in the first 3 months of 2021. One of the reasons for that is their tech market, which while being productive in Israel, it is also one of the best in the world, both in innovation and profitability. Militarily, Israel hit 1,600 military targets. With a few days left in the conflict, Israel had a 95% kill rate on rockets being fired, as they only shoot down rockets going towards populated areas. In total, Hamas fired 4,369 rockets and 2/3 of those missed their targets, landing in fields, or misfiring and landing in Gaza. These misfires possibly contributed to Gaza citizens' deaths. 1,500 rockets reached their targets of highly populated civilian areas. By the end of the war, 90% of those were intercepted. There is some debate as to how much manning this rocket defense system, Iron Dome, costed Israel. Each projectile is estimated by some to be $100,000 each. Wikipedia claims they are worth $40,000 each, while other media outlets value them at $80,000. With all these numbers in mind, we have created an estimate of how much the rockets cost Hamas and how much the Iron Dome cost Israel. The cost for Hamas was $3.5 million to $8.7 million, while the cost for Israel was $30 million to $120 million. These costs still don't really give us a winner though, as the US plans to aid Gaza and Israel. However, the US did state they would help the Palestinian Authority and ensure that Hamas did not benefit from any aid. Biden also promised to help Israel renew its arsenal of Iron Dome projectiles. With all this information in mind, both sides posted lots of propaganda in conclusion of the mini-war. Hamas made big claims about Al-Aqsa that were not backed up by Egypt, which had created the ceasefire. Israel propaganda, meanwhile, called for a longer war in the future. With both Israel and Hamas claiming victory, the international community together agreed that the war was inconclusive and that there was no victor. One big win for Israel was a strong statement of eternal support for Israel until Arabs, Palestinians, and Hamas acknowledged Israel's right to exist. Anti-Semitic attacks in the US and in Turkey also gave Israel a win, as it gives them the opportunity to expose anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism. The biggest loss was for Palestine, as Hamas called for more resistance, rather than negotiations. With the support in Palestine for Hamas growing, and possible support by the UN growing, the likelihood of a two-state solution also is slipping, which is a huge loss for Palestine, caused by Hamas. Nations around the world are losing faith in the two-state solution, decreasing their donations to Palestine, or completely ending their donations. In Palestine as well, they have lost hope of a two-state solution. In the end, this makes Hamas and Palestine the biggest losers.